Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had always been different from other soldiers. While most of her fellow servicemen and women spent their free time at the base recreation center or off-base bars, Maria could be found in the gym at 5 in the morning, pushing herself through grueling workouts that would make even the toughest Marines think twice. Her dedication wasn't just about staying in shape for military requirements, it was deeply personal. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, Maria learned early that respect wasn't given freely. It had to be earned, sometimes with your fists. Her father, a construction worker who worked double shifts to keep food on the table, had taught her that backing down from a fight only invited more trouble. Her mother, a nurse who worked nights at the local hospital, showed her that being strong didn't mean being cruel, but it did mean standing up for what was right. Maria enlisted in the Army at 18, not because she had nowhere else to go like so many of her peers, but because she wanted to serve something bigger than herself. She wanted to prove that a girl from the barrio could make it anywhere, even in the male-dominated world of the military. The transition from civilian life to military discipline had been easier for Maria than for most recruits. She was already used to getting up before dawn, already accustomed to pushing through pain and exhaustion. Fort Carson, Colorado had been her home for the past 3 years. The sprawling military installation housed thousands of soldiers, and Maria had worked her way up from private to staff sergeant through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to excellence. She served in the 4th Infantry Division, specializing in logistics and supply chain management. It wasn't the most glamorous job in the Army, but Maria took pride in ensuring that soldiers had what they needed when they needed it. The base was like a small city, complete with its own post office, commissary, bank, and even a shopping center. But like any community, it had its share of problems. Theft was one of them. Despite strict military regulations and the severe consequences that came with stealing from fellow soldiers, incidents still occurred. Usually, it was small stuff, personal items from barracks rooms, food from the dining facility, or equipment that soldiers borrowed and forgot to return. Maria's reputation on base was well established. She was known as someone who didn't tolerate nonsense, but she was also respected for her fairness and integrity. Younger soldiers often came to her for advice, knowing she would give it to them straight without judgment. Her squad leaders trusted her to handle difficult situations, and her commanding officers knew they could count on her to get things done right the first time. The incident that would define Maria's military career began on a Tuesday morning in late October. The Colorado air was crisp, with the first hints of winter beginning to show in the Rocky Mountains that surrounded the base. Maria had just finished her morning physical training and was heading to the logistics building where her office was located. She carried a military-issued laptop bag that contained not just her computer, but also important documents related to an upcoming inspection and her personal items including her wallet, keys, and phone. The bag also contained something far more valuable than money or electronics, a small wooden box that held her father's Purple Heart medal from his service in Vietnam. He had given it to her the day before she deployed to Afghanistan on her first tour, telling her to carry a piece of his courage with her. Maria had carried that medal through 2 deployments, and it had become her most treasured possession. As she walked across the base, Maria noticed 3 soldiers standing near the parking lot outside the logistics building. She recognized them as members of a transportation unit that had recently arrived at Fort Carson. Private First Class Jake Morrison, a tall, lanky soldier with nervous energy who seemed to always be looking over his shoulder. Specialist Tommy Rodriguez, shorter but stockier, with the kind of swagger that young soldiers sometimes developed when they thought they knew more than they actually did. And Private Danny Walsh, the youngest of the 3, barely 19 years old, and still trying to find his place in the military hierarchy. Maria had encountered this particular group before, and the interactions hadn't been positive. They had a reputation around base for pushing boundaries, testing what they could get away with. There had been complaints about their behavior in the dining facility, reports of them harassing female soldiers, and whispers about minor thefts that couldn't be proven but seemed to follow in their wake. The 3 soldiers were huddled together, speaking in low voices and occasionally glancing around to see who might be watching. Their body language set off alarm bells in Maria's mind. In her years of military service, she had developed a 6th sense about trouble, and these 3 were radiating it like heat from a bonfire. Maria adjusted her grip on her laptop bag, and continued walking toward the building entrance. She could feel the weight of the wooden box containing her father's medal pressing against her hip through the bag's fabric. The medal represented more than just her father's service. It symbolized her family's legacy of military honor and her own commitment to upholding those values. As she approached the entrance, Maria became aware that the three soldiers had changed their positioning. What had appeared to be casual conversation now looked more like a coordinated movement. Morrison had moved to her left, Rodriguez was directly ahead, and Walsh was circling around to her right. The hair on the back of Maria's neck stood up, and she felt her muscles tense in preparation for whatever was about to happen. "Hey, Sergeant Santos," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that didn't match the look in his eyes. "Heading into work early again?" Maria stopped walking and assessed the situation. The parking lot was relatively empty at this hour, with most soldiers already at their duty stations or still in the dining facility having breakfast. The logistics building wouldn't open for another 20 minutes, and the closest occupied building was a good 100 yards away. If these three had chosen this time and place for a confrontation, they had planned it carefully. "That's Staff Sergeant Santos," Maria corrected, her voice steady and professional. "And yes, I have work to do, if you'll excuse me." She tried to continue toward the building entrance, but Morrison stepped into her path, forcing her to stop again. The soldier was grinning, but there was nothing friendly about the expression. It was the kind of smile that predators wore when they cornered their prey. "Come on, Staff Sergeant," Morrison said, emphasizing the rank with mock respect. "We just want to talk. You're always in such a hurry. Maybe you should slow down, enjoy the morning." Maria's training kicked in. She had been through countless hours of combatives training, learning how to defend herself and others. But this situation was complicated by the fact that these were fellow soldiers, not enemy combatants. She couldn't simply attack them without justification, no matter what her instincts were telling her about their intentions. "I don't have time for whatever this is," Maria said firmly. "Move out of my way." Walsh spoke up from her right side, his young voice cracking slightly with nervousness. "Maybe she's got something important in that bag, something worth protecting." The comment sent a chill down Maria's spine. These weren't just three soldiers looking to harass a female NCO. They had been watching her, studying her routines, and they knew she carried valuable items in her laptop bag. This was a planned robbery, and they had chosen her as their target. Maria's mind raced through her options. She could try to de-escalate the situation verbally, but the positioning of the three soldiers suggested they were committed to whatever plan they had hatched. She could try to run, but Rodriguez was blocking her path to the building, and the other two were positioned to cut off any retreat. She could try to fight her way out, but taking on three opponents simultaneously was risky even for someone with her training. The laptop bag suddenly felt heavier in her grip. Inside was her father's Purple Heart, a symbol of courage under fire and sacrifice for a cause greater than oneself. The medal had seen her through her darkest moments during deployment, reminding her of the strength that ran in her family's blood. She wouldn't let three bullies take that from her, regardless of the consequences. "Last warning," Maria said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone that her soldiers would have recognized immediately. "Get out of my way." Rodriguez laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls of the nearby buildings. What? You gonna tell our commanding officer?" "Maybe file a complaint? We're not doing anything wrong here, Sergeant. Just having a friendly conversation." The situation was escalating quickly, and Maria knew that within the next few seconds, words were going to give way to action. She shifted her stance slightly, preparing to defend herself and her belongings. Her father's medal seemed to pulse with warmth against her hip, reminding her of the courage that had carried her family through generations of service. Morrison took a step closer, his hands moving in a way that suggested he was preparing to grab for her bag. His eyes had lost any pretense of friendliness, replaced by the calculating look of someone committed to taking what they wanted regardless of the cost. Walsh was fidgeting nervously, but moving into position to support his friend's actions. "Nice bag," Morrison commented, reaching out as if to touch the strap. "Military issue, right? Bet it holds all kinds of interesting stuff." Maria pulled the bag closer to her body and took a half step back, giving herself more room to maneuver while keeping all three potential attackers in her line of sight. Her heart rate increased, but her breathing remained controlled. This was exactly the kind of situation her combatives training had prepared her for. Multiple attackers with unknown intentions in an isolated location. "Don't touch my property," Maria warned, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "And don't test me." Rodriguez's smile widened, showing teeth. "Tough girl, huh? We heard about you. Word is you think you're some kind of badass because you did a couple tours overseas. But you're not over there now, Sergeant. You're here with us." The threat was implicit but clear. These three had targeted her specifically, knowing her background and believing they could intimidate her into compliance. They had made a serious miscalculation. Maria's deployments hadn't just taught her how to handle combat situations, they had taught her how to recognize and respond to threats before they fully developed. Walsh moved closer from her right side, trying to flank her while Morrison and Rodriguez held her attention from the front and left. The coordination of their movements confirmed what Maria already suspected. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. They had planned this confrontation, chosen the time and place, and positioned themselves for maximum advantage. But they had underestimated their target in ways that were about to become painfully clear. Maria had grown up fighting boys bigger than her in her neighborhood. She had survived 2 combat deployments where hesitation could mean death. She had earned her rank through competence and courage, not politics or favoritism. And most importantly, she carried with her the legacy of a father who had earned his Purple Heart by refusing to abandon his wounded comrades under enemy fire. She wasn't about to let 3 cowards steal that legacy from her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as the 4 soldiers faced off in what was about to become a defining moment for all of them. Maria could see in Morrison's eyes the exact second he made the decision to move from threats to action. His muscles tensed, his weight shifted forward, and his hand moved toward her bag. That was when Maria Santos, staff sergeant in the United States Army and daughter of a Purple Heart recipient, decided she had heard enough talk. The moment Morrison's hand reached for her bag, Maria's training took over. Years of combat experience had taught her that the difference between winning and losing a fight often came down to who acted first when violence became inevitable. She didn't wait for him to make contact with her property. Instead, she stepped forward into his reach and drove her knee upward toward his solar plexus with lightning speed. Morrison barely had time to register what was happening before Maria's knee connected with devastating force. The impact drove the air from his lungs in a harsh whoosh, and he doubled over, gasping and clutching his midsection. Maria followed up immediately by bringing her elbow down hard on the back of his neck, sending him crashing to the pavement where he lay groaning and struggling to breathe. Rodriguez and Walsh stood frozen for a split second, shocked by the sudden explosion of violence and the speed with which their leader had been neutralized. That moment of hesitation cost them dearly. Maria had learned in Afghanistan that in a multiple attacker situation, you had to press your advantage immediately and aggressively. There was no time for mercy or second thoughts. She spun toward Rodriguez, who was fumbling to pull something from his pocket. Whether it was a weapon or just his phone to call for backup, Maria didn't care. She launched herself at him with a straight punch to his throat that stopped whatever he was planning. Rodriguez staggered backward, choking and clawing at his neck. But Maria didn't give him time to recover. She grabbed his shirt with both hands and drove her forehead into his nose with a sickening crunch. Blood exploded across Rodriguez's face as his nose broke, and he screamed in pain and shock. Maria released her grip on his shirt and let him fall backward onto the concrete, where he writhed in agony while blood poured down his face and onto his uniform. Walsh, the youngest of the 3, looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would appear to help his friends or stop the violence that had erupted so suddenly. His nerve broke completely when Maria turned her attention to him, her eyes blazing with controlled fury and adrenaline. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, backing away rapidly. "Please, Sergeant Santos," Walsh stammered, his voice high and panicked. "I didn't want to do this. They made me come with them. I was just supposed to watch for other people. I wasn't going to touch your stuff, I swear." Maria advanced on him slowly, her breathing controlled despite the violence she had just unleashed. The laptop bag remained secure in her left hand, while her right stayed ready to strike again if necessary. She could hear Morrison behind her, still gasping for air and trying to push himself up from the pavement, and Rodriguez's agonized moaning as he held his shattered nose. You think being the lookout makes you innocent? Maria asked Walsh, her voice deadly quiet. You think standing there while your friends try to rob me makes you any less guilty? Walsh continued, backing away, tears starting to form in his eyes. He was just a kid, barely out of high school, and probably got caught up with the wrong crowd trying to fit in. But Maria had learned long ago that good intentions didn't matter when someone was trying to take what belonged to you. Sympathy was a luxury she couldn't afford in a fight. I'm sorry, Walsh blubbered. Please don't hurt me. I'll tell them to leave you alone. I'll make sure this never happens again. You're right, Maria said, still advancing. You'll make sure this never happens again, because you're going to learn right now what happens when you mess with the wrong person. She feinted toward Walsh's face, and when he flinched and raised his hands to protect himself, she pivoted and drove her knee into his stomach with enough force to lift him off his feet. Walsh folded in half around her knee, vomiting onto the pavement as his body went limp. Maria let him fall and stepped back to assess the situation. All three attackers were down and no longer posed an immediate threat. Morrison was slowly getting to his hands and knees, still struggling to breathe normally. Rodriguez was sitting on the ground holding his broken nose and crying from the pain. Walsh was curled up in a fetal position, alternately vomiting and sobbing. Maria took a moment to check herself for injuries. Her knee was slightly sore from the impacts and her knuckles were scraped, but she was otherwise unharmed. Her laptop bag was intact and she could still feel the reassuring weight of her father's metal inside. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes from start to finish, but even as the immediate danger passed, Maria knew her problems were just beginning. She had just beaten up 3 fellow soldiers on a military base, and regardless of the justification, there would be consequences. The Army didn't look kindly on violence between service members, especially when it resulted in injuries that would require medical attention. The sound of running footsteps made Maria look up from the 3 groaning soldiers at her feet. 2 military police officers were jogging toward them from the direction of the MP station, their hands resting on their service weapons. Someone had obviously heard the commotion and called for help. "Nobody move!" the first MP shouted as he approached. "Everyone stay where you are." Maria set her laptop bag down carefully and raised her hands to show they were empty. She had been through enough encounters with military law enforcement to know that cooperation was the best way to avoid escalating an already complicated situation. "Staff Sergeant Santos, 4th Infantry Division," she announced clearly. "These 3 soldiers attempted to rob me, and I defended myself." The MPs approached cautiously, taking in the scene of 3 injured soldiers and 1 woman standing calmly with her hands raised. The lead officer, a sergeant first class named Jackson, whom Maria recognized from around base, looked confused by what he was seeing. "Are you injured, Staff Sergeant?" Jackson asked. "No, Sergeant, I'm fine." Jackson's partner, a young specialist whose name tape read Chen, was checking on the 3 men on the ground. Morrison was finally able to breathe normally and was sitting up, though he was still holding his stomach. Rodriguez had managed to stop the bleeding from his nose somewhat, but it was clearly broken and would need medical attention. Walsh was the worst off, still retching and unable to sit up on his own. "We need medics," Chen called out, speaking into his radio. 3 soldiers down with injuries, possible assault. "It wasn't assault," Maria said firmly. "It was self-defense against attempted robbery." Jackson looked at her with a mixture of respect and concern. He had heard about Maria's reputation on base. Her military record was exemplary, and she was known as someone who didn't cause trouble or make false accusations. But the scene in front of him suggested a level of violence that was difficult to reconcile with a simple self-defense claim. "Can you tell me exactly what happened here, Staff Sergeant?" Jackson asked. Maria gave him a concise but complete account of the morning's events, from her observation of the 3 soldiers' suspicious behavior, to their positioning around her, to their explicit threats and attempted theft. She spoke in the clear, professional manner of someone giving a military briefing, sticking to facts and avoiding emotional language. As she spoke, Jackson took notes and occasionally glanced at the 3 injured soldiers. Morrison was now able to speak, though his voice was hoarse and painful. Rodriguez had stopped crying, but was still holding his nose and breathing through his mouth. Walsh had finally stopped vomiting but remained curled up on the ground, moaning softly. "That's not what happened," Morrison wheezed when Maria finished her account. "We were just talking to her. She attacked us for no reason. Bullshit, Maria said flatly. You positioned yourselves to box me in. You made threatening comments about my bag, and you reached for my property without permission. That's attempted robbery. We never touched your bag, Rodriguez said through his swollen nose, his words muffled and nasal. We were just having a conversation. Chen looked up from where he was checking Walsh's condition. This kid says they were planning to take her stuff, says the other two talked him into being a lookout. Walsh, apparently realizing that his friends were trying to deny the truth, struggled to sit up. She's telling the truth, he said weakly. They said we could take her bag and she wouldn't fight back because she's just a girl. They said we could sell whatever was inside and split the money. Morrison and Rodriguez immediately started protesting Walsh's statement, claiming he was confused or lying to save himself. But the damage was done. Walsh's confession corroborated Maria's version of events and provided evidence of premeditation. The arrival of the medics created a temporary distraction as they began treating the 3 injured soldiers. On Rodriguez's nose was clearly broken and would require surgery to repair properly. Morrison had bruised ribs and possible internal injuries that would need X-rays to rule out. Walsh appeared to have a concussion along with his stomach injuries. As the medics worked, Jackson continued his investigation. He examined the area where the confrontation had taken place, looking for evidence that might support either version of events. The positioning of scuff marks on the pavement and droplets of blood told a story that aligned with Maria's account of multiple attackers converging on her position. Staff Sergeant, Jackson said quietly, I need to ask you about the level of force you used. These soldiers are going to need significant medical treatment. Was all of this necessary? Maria looked at the 3 men being loaded onto stretchers and felt no remorse for their injuries. Sergeant Jackson, I was outnumbered 3-1 by soldiers who had planned to rob me. I used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat and protect my property. If they needed significant medical treatment, maybe they should have thought about that before they decided to become thieves. Jackson nodded slowly. He understood the military principle of using appropriate force to defend yourself and others, and Maria's explanation was consistent with her training and experience. But he also knew that the investigation was far from over, and there would be serious questions asked about this incident at levels far above his pay grade. More MPs arrived to secure the scene and take statements from any witnesses who might have observed the confrontation. Unfortunately, the early morning hour and isolated location meant there were few people around to corroborate either version of events. The investigation would largely come down to physical evidence and the credibility of the people involved. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the commanding officer of the 4th Infantry Division, arrived just as the medics were finishing their work. Martinez was a career officer with over 20 years of experience, and she had a reputation for being tough but fair. She took one look at the scene and immediately began asking pointed questions. Sergeant Jackson, give me a briefing, Martinez ordered. Jackson summarized the situation as he understood it, presenting both Maria's account of self-defense against attempted robbery and the injured soldier's claims of an unprovoked attack. Martinez listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as the details emerged. When Jackson finished, Martinez turned to Maria. Staff Sergeant Santos, you realize this is going to require a formal investigation? There will be an Article 15 hearing at minimum, possibly court-martial proceedings depending on what we find. Yes, ma'am, Maria replied. I understand the seriousness of the situation, but I maintain that my actions were justified under the circumstances. Martinez studied Maria's face, looking for any sign of doubt or deception. She found neither. Maria met her commanding officer's gaze steadily, showing the confidence of someone who believed in the righteousness of her actions. You're confined to quarters pending the investigation, Martinez decided. You'll surrender your weapon and report to the CQ desk every 4 hours. Is that understood? Understood, ma'am. As Maria watched her commanding officer walk away, and the MPs finished processing the scene, she felt the weight of uncertainty settling over her. Her military career, which she had built through years of dedicated service and personal sacrifice, now hung in the balance because she had refused to let 3 cowards steal from her. But as she picked up her laptop bag and felt her father's Purple Heart medal inside, Maria knew she had made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The next few weeks would test everything she believed about justice, honor, and the military system she had devoted her life to serving. But Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The investigation began immediately, and Maria quickly discovered that military justice operated on its own timeline and according to its own rules. While she remained confined to quarters, investigators from the Criminal Investigation Division descended on Fort Carson to piece together exactly what had happened in that parking lot. Special Agent Rebecca Torres was assigned as the lead investigator. Torres was a former Marine who had transitioned to Army CID after completing law school, and she had a reputation for thoroughness and objectivity. She interviewed Maria for the first time 3 days after the incident, in a sterile conference room at the CID office. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Torres began, reviewing her notes. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me about your history with these 3 soldiers." Maria recounted the previous encounters she had had with Morrison, Rodriguez, and Walsh. The complaints about their behavior in the dining facility, the reports of harassment, and the general reputation they had developed around base for pushing boundaries and causing trouble. "Did you ever file formal complaints about their behavior?" Torres asked. "No, ma'am. The incidents I witnessed weren't severe enough to warrant formal action, and the complaints I heard were second-hand. I made a mental note to keep an eye on them, but I didn't have enough evidence to pursue disciplinary action." Torres made notes and continued her questioning. "Take me through the morning of the incident. What made you first notice these 3 soldiers?" Maria described her observations of their suspicious behavior and positioning, explaining how her military training and combat experience had alerted her to potential trouble. Torres listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "When Private First Class Morrison reached for your bag, why didn't you try to de-escalate verbally or retreat instead of using physical force?" "Ma'am, they had positioned themselves to prevent retreat, and I had already attempted verbal de-escalation. When Morrison reached for my property after I had explicitly told him not to, I determined that force was necessary to protect myself and my belongings. What exactly was in the bag that was so important you were willing to fight 3 soldiers to protect it?" Maria paused, her hand instinctively moving to touch the area where her father's medal rested. "Military laptop, official documents, personal items, including my wallet and phone. But most importantly, my father's Purple Heart medal from Vietnam. It's irreplaceable." Torres looked up from her notes. "You carried your father's Purple Heart with you to work every day?" "Yes, ma'am. I've carried it through 2 combat deployments. It's a reminder of the courage and honor expected of soldiers in our family." The interview continued for over 2 hours, with Torres probing every aspect of Maria's account. She asked about Maria's combatives training, her deployment experiences, and her understanding of the rules of engagement for self-defense situations. Throughout it all, Maria maintained her composure and answered honestly, even when the questions seemed designed to trap her or make her doubt her actions. Meanwhile, the 3 injured soldiers were also being interviewed from their hospital beds. Morrison had suffered bruised ribs and a mild concussion but was expected to make a full recovery. Rodriguez required surgery to repair his broken nose and would have permanent scarring. Walsh had the most serious injuries, a severe concussion and internal bruising that kept him hospitalized for over a week. The stories they told investigators were significantly different from Maria's account. According to them, they had simply approached her to ask about duty schedules and had been shocked when she suddenly attacked them without warning. They claimed they had never threatened her or attempted to take her bag, and that Walsh's confession at the scene had been made under duress while he was injured and confused. "She just went crazy," Morrison told Torres during his interview. "One second we're having a normal conversation, and the next second she's beating us up. I think she's got some kind of PTSD or something from her deployments." Rodriguez's story was similar, though his account was hampered by his injuries and pain medication. "We heard she was tough, but we were just trying to be friendly. Maybe ask her about opportunities in logistics. She totally overreacted." Walsh, however, was having second thoughts about protecting his friends. The severity of his injuries and the reality of potential criminal charges had given him time to reconsider his loyalties. When Torres interviewed him privately, his story began to change. "Look, I know what I said when the MPs first showed up," Walsh admitted reluctantly. "But I was hurt and scared. I didn't know what I was saying." "Are you recanting your earlier statement?" Torres asked. "I'm saying maybe I was confused. Maybe we were just talking to her and she misunderstood our intentions. but Torres had been investigating military crimes for years, and she could smell a coached story from a mile away. Walsh's hesitation and the way his eyes darted around when he spoke told her that someone had been pressuring him to change his testimony. Private Walsh, are you aware that lying to a federal investigator is a felony that could result in imprisonment and dishonorable discharge? The young soldier's resolve crumbled. They said if I stuck to the story about just talking to her, they'd make sure I didn't get in serious trouble. They said the worst that would happen is maybe some extra duty or a reduction in rank. Who told you this? Rodriguez's older brother. He's a sergeant first class in their unit. He came to visit Rodriguez in the hospital and told me I needed to keep my mouth shut about what really happened. The attempted witness tampering added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Torres immediately launched a separate inquiry into the elder Rodriguez's actions and placed Walsh in protective custody to prevent further intimidation. As the investigation progressed, more evidence began to emerge that supported Maria's version of events. Security cameras from nearby buildings had captured portions of the confrontation, showing the three soldiers positioning themselves around Maria in what clearly appeared to be a coordinated ambush. Audio equipment used for base security had picked up fragments of the conversation, including Rodriguez's taunting comments about Maria's deployment history and Morrison's threats. The physical evidence also supported Maria's self-defense claims. The positioning of blood spatter, scuff marks on the pavement, and the angles of the injuries sustained by the three men all indicated that Maria had been surrounded and had fought her way out rather than launching an unprovoked attack. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against Morrison, Rodriguez, and Walsh came from their own barracks mates. When investigators interviewed other soldiers in their unit, a pattern of behavior emerged that painted a picture of three young men who had been planning increasingly serious criminal activities. Specialist Jennifer Murphy, who lived in the same barracks as the three men, told investigators that she had overheard them discussing ways to make money on the side. They talked about how some of the NCOs carried valuable stuff in their bags and how easy it would be to just take it if they picked the right target. Private First Class David Kim, who had the misfortune of being assigned the same shift duties as the trio, reported that Morrison had specifically mentioned Staff Sergeant Santos as a potential target. He said she was always carrying that laptop bag around, and since she was a woman, she probably wouldn't fight back if they just grabbed it and ran. The most damning testimony came from Private Lisa Chen, who revealed that Rodriguez had shown her a diagram he had drawn of the base layout, marking the locations where female soldiers typically walked alone and identifying areas with limited security camera coverage. He said they were going to start collecting rent from soldiers who wanted to avoid trouble. Chen testified. When I asked what that meant, he said some people needed to pay for protection, and others needed to learn not to carry expensive things where everyone could see them. As the evidence mounted against the three accused soldiers, Maria's legal situation began to improve. The base's staff judge advocate, Major Kevin O'Brien, reviewed the investigation findings and concluded that Maria's use of force had been justified under the circumstances. Staff Sergeant Santos was faced with a premeditated robbery attempt by three coordinated attackers, O'Brien wrote in his legal opinion. Her response was proportional to the threat presented and consistent with her training and the military's emphasis on self-protection and defense of property. However, the investigation revealed another troubling aspect of the case. The three would-be robbers had not acted entirely on their own initiative. Further interviews revealed that they had been encouraged and advised by a group of older soldiers who had been engaging in similar activities for months. Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson, Rodriguez's brother, was found to be the ringleader of a broader criminal enterprise operating on base. Thompson had recruited younger, more vulnerable soldiers to carry out thefts and robberies, while he provided protection and guidance from his position of authority. The investigation expanded to include at least 7 other soldiers and revealed thefts totaling thousands of dollars in military and personal property. The realization that Maria had unknowingly disrupted a significant criminal operation added another dimension to her case. Rather than being seen as a soldier who had lost control and injured 3 fellow service members, she was now viewed as someone who had exposed and helped shut down a criminal network that had been preying on the base community for months. Colonel Martinez called Maria into her office 2 weeks after the initial incident to inform her of the investigation's preliminary findings. Staff Sergeant Santos, I want you to know that the evidence strongly supports your account of what happened that morning. You appear to have been targeted by individuals who were part of a larger criminal conspiracy. Thank you, ma'am. I'm glad the truth is coming to light. However, Martinez continued, there are still going to be administrative consequences. The level of injuries sustained by the 3 soldiers, regardless of the justification, requires formal review. You'll face an Article 15 hearing, but I expect the outcome to be favorable given the circumstances. Maria felt a mixture of relief and continued concern. While the investigation was vindicating her actions, the military bureaucracy still demanded its due process. Her career remained in limbo, and the stress of the situation was beginning to take its toll. The story had also attracted attention beyond the base. Military news websites picked up the story of a female NCO who had single-handedly fought off 3 would-be robbers, and Maria found herself receiving messages of support from soldiers at bases around the world. Some praised her courage and fighting skills, while others expressed concern about the broader security issues revealed by the criminal conspiracy. But not all the attention was positive. Some critics questioned whether Maria's response had been excessive, arguing that the level of violence used against fellow soldiers was inappropriate regardless of their intentions. Anonymous comments on social media suggested that Maria had overreacted and that better conflict resolution skills could have prevented the injuries. These criticisms stung particularly because they came from people who hadn't been there and didn't understand the split-second decisions required in a potentially dangerous situation. Maria had spent years learning to trust her instincts and react decisively when threatened, and second-guessing those instincts now felt like a betrayal of everything she had learned about survival and self-protection. The psychological pressure of the investigation and public scrutiny began to affect Maria's daily life. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if other soldiers viewed her as a dangerous person to avoid. Sleep became difficult as she replayed the confrontation in her mind, analyzing every decision and wondering if she could have handled things differently. Her father called her regularly during this period, offering the kind of steady support that had carried her through difficult times in the past. "Mija," he told her during one late-night conversation, "you protected yourself, and you protected the honor I gave you with that medal. That's what soldiers do. They stand up to bullies and protect what matters." But Maria knew that the hardest part of her ordeal was still ahead. The Article 15 hearing would determine not just her immediate punishment, but potentially the entire future of her military career. Everything she had worked for over the past 6 years hung in the balance, and the outcome would depend on convincing a panel of officers that she had acted appropriately when faced with an impossible situation. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and Maria spent the weekend preparing her testimony and gathering character witnesses who could speak to her integrity and judgment. She knew she had the facts on her side, but military justice sometimes operated according to considerations beyond simple truth and falsehood. As Sunday evening arrived and Maria prepared for what might be the most important day of her military career, she held her father's Purple Heart medal and drew strength from its weight and history. Whatever happened in that hearing room, she had defended what mattered most to her, and she would face the consequences with the same courage that had carried her family through generations of military service. The Article 15 hearing convened on Monday morning in the base conference room, with Colonel Martinez presiding over the proceedings. The formal military setting, with its flags and official portraits, reminded Maria of the gravity of the situation. Her military career and future hung in the balance, and every word spoken in this room would be carefully weighed and recorded. Major O'Brien served as Maria's defense counsel, while Captain Susan Lewis represented the prosecution. Despite the evidence that had emerged during the investigation, the Army still needed to formally determine whether Maria's use of force had been appropriate and within military regulations. This hearing will determine whether Staff Sergeant Santos used excessive force in defending herself against what she perceived as a robbery attempt. Colonel Martinez announced to open the proceedings. "We will examine all evidence and testimony to ensure that justice is served fairly to all parties involved." The prosecution began by calling Morrison to testify. The young soldier appeared in full dress uniform, though his movements were still somewhat stiff due to his injuries. He maintained his story that the 3 soldiers had simply approached Maria for a friendly conversation and had been shocked by her violent response. "We just wanted to ask her about opportunities and logistics," Morrison testified. "Maybe get some advice about advancing our careers. We heard she was someone who helped younger soldiers, so we thought we'd talk to her." Captain Lewis guided Morrison through his version of events, emphasizing the severity of his injuries and the sudden nature of Maria's attack. Did Staff Sergeant Santos give you any warning before she struck you? 1 second we're talking, and the next second her knee is in my stomach. It was like she just snapped. Major O'Brien's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. He immediately confronted Morrison with the physical evidence that contradicted his testimony. Private Morrison, you testified that you approached Staff Sergeant Santos for a friendly conversation. Can you explain why security cameras show you and your companions positioning yourselves to surround her in a triangular formation? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. I don't know anything about formations. We were just standing around talking. And can you explain why audio recordings from base security equipment captured you saying, and I quote, "Nice bag, bet it holds all kinds of interesting stuff"? I don't remember saying that. You don't remember, or you're lying under oath. Captain Lewis objected to the aggressive questioning, but the damage was done. Morrison's credibility was crumbling under the weight of contradictory evidence. O'Brien continued his assault on Morrison's testimony by introducing the diagram that Rodriguez had drawn, showing isolated areas of the base where female soldiers walked alone. Are you familiar with this document, Private Morrison? Morrison studied the paper with obvious discomfort. I've never seen that before. Really? Because your fingerprints are on it, and 3 witnesses have testified that they saw you and Rodriguez studying this diagram while discussing potential targets for robbery. The prosecution's case continued to unravel as Rodriguez and Walsh took the stand. Rodriguez stuck to his story despite the overwhelming evidence against him, but his credibility was destroyed when O'Brien revealed that his older brother had attempted to coach witnesses to lie during the investigation. Walsh, however, surprised everyone by returning to his original confession. The young soldier looked directly at Maria as he spoke, his voice shaking with emotion. I'm sorry, Staff Sergeant Santos. I lied when I said we were just talking to you. We planned the whole thing. Morrison said female soldiers wouldn't fight back, and Rodriguez had been watching you for weeks, timing your routine and figuring out when you'd be alone. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Walsh's testimony confirmed the premeditated nature of the attempted robbery. Captain Lewis tried to discredit Walsh's testimony by arguing that he was trying to curry favor with the court, but the damage to the prosecution's case was severe. We were supposed to take your bag and run, Walsh continued, tears streaming down his face. Rodriguez said you probably had valuable electronics and maybe cash. We needed money because we were behind on payments to Sergeant Thompson for protection from harassment by older soldiers. This revelation about the broader criminal conspiracy operating on base added another layer of complexity to the case. It became clear that Morrison, Rodriguez, and Walsh were not simply opportunistic criminals, but victims themselves, who had been coerced into criminal activity by more senior soldiers. The defense phase of the hearing began with character witnesses testifying on Maria's behalf. Her former squad members spoke about her leadership during combat deployments and her reputation for helping younger soldiers navigate military life. Her commanding officers praised her professionalism and integrity. Captain Sarah Williams, who had served alongside Maria in Afghanistan, gave particularly powerful testimony about Maria's character under pressure. Staff Sergeant Santos saved my life during a Taliban ambush in Kandahar, Williams testified. She risked her own safety to pull me to cover and provided medical aid under enemy fire. She's exactly the kind of soldier you want watching your back. Sergeant Major James Patterson, the senior enlisted advisor for the 4th Infantry Division, testified about Maria's reputation throughout the base community. Staff Sergeant Santos is known for mentoring younger soldiers and maintaining the highest standards of conduct. If she used force, it was because the situation demanded it. When Maria took the stand in her own defense, she spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had thoroughly examined her actions and found them justified. She walked the court through her decision-making process during the confrontation, explaining how her training and experience had guided her responses. I gave them multiple opportunities to de-escalate, Maria testified. I used verbal commands, I attempted to withdraw from the situation, and I clearly stated that they should not touch my property. When Private Morrison reached for my bag despite these warnings, I determined that force was necessary to protect myself and my belongings. Major O'Brien guided Maria through a detailed explanation of her combatives training and the military's emphasis on decisive action in self-defense situations. Were you trained to use minimal force or maximum effectiveness when defending yourself? Maximum effectiveness, sir. Military combatives training emphasizes neutralizing threats quickly and decisively. Holding back in a multiple attacker situation could have resulted in my being overpowered and seriously injured. Did you consider the possibility that these 3 soldiers were just playing a prank or engaging in harmless harassment? No, sir. Their coordination, their body language, and their explicit statements about my bag indicated serious criminal intent. In my experience, people who intend harmless pranks don't position themselves to prevent escape routes. Captain Lewis's cross-examination focused on the severity of the injuries Maria had inflicted, arguing that she had used excessive force against fellow soldiers. Staff Sergeant Santos, did you consider using less violent methods to defend yourself? Perhaps running away or calling for help? Ma'am, they had positioned themselves to prevent retreat, and the nearest help was too far away to be effective. I used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. You call breaking a soldier's nose and giving another a concussion minimum force? Ma'am, I used standard combatives techniques that I was trained to employ against multiple attackers. If they sustained serious injuries, it's because they chose to engage in criminal behavior despite knowing the potential consequences. The hearing's most emotional moment came when Maria explained the significance of her father's Purple Heart medal and why protecting it had been worth the risk of fighting 3 opponents. That medal represents my family's legacy of military service and sacrifice, Maria said, her voice steady despite the intensity of her emotions. My father earned it by refusing to abandon wounded comrades under enemy fire in Vietnam. It's irreplaceable, and I wasn't going to let 3 criminals steal it because they thought I was an easy target. Colonel Martinez asked Maria directly whether she had any regrets about her actions that morning. Maria considered the question carefully before answering. I regret that the situation escalated to violence, and I regret that 3 fellow soldiers were injured. But I don't regret defending myself and my property when faced with a coordinated criminal attack. If I had it to do over again, I would make the same choices. The final phase of the hearing included testimony about the broader criminal conspiracy that had been operating on base. Special Agent Torres presented evidence showing that Morrison, Rodriguez, and Walsh were part of a larger network that had been preying on soldiers for months. The scope of the criminal enterprise shocked even experienced military justice officials. Our investigation revealed at least 15 separate incidents of theft, extortion, and intimidation involving this criminal network, Torres testified. Staff Sergeant Santos's actions that morning disrupted what had become a significant threat to base security and soldier welfare. Sergeant First Class Thompson, the ringleader of the criminal conspiracy, had already been court-martialed and sentenced to 10 years in military prison. His conviction lent additional credibility to Maria's claims that she had been targeted by organized criminals rather than simply involved in a misunderstanding with fellow soldiers. After 3 days of testimony and evidence presentation, Colonel Martinez recessed the hearing for deliberation. Maria spent the waiting period in a state of anxious anticipation, knowing that her entire future hung in the balance. Her father flew in from Los Angeles to provide support during this critical time. "Whatever happens, mija, you did the right thing," her father told her as they sat together in the base visitor center. "You stood up to bullies, you protected what mattered, and you showed them that our family doesn't back down from fights." The hearing reconvened on Thursday morning for Colonel Martinez to announce her decision. The conference room was packed with soldiers who had followed the case, media representatives, and military justice officials who understood the precedent-setting nature of the proceedings. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, Colonel Martinez announced, "This hearing finds that Staff Sergeant Santos's use of force was justified under the circumstances. She faced a coordinated criminal attack by multiple assailants who had premeditated their assault and positioned themselves to prevent her escape." Relief flooded through Maria as she heard the words that cleared her of wrongdoing. But Colonel Martinez wasn't finished. However, the severity of the injuries sustained by the 3 soldiers, while justified, still requires administrative action. Staff Sergeant Santos will receive a letter of counseling documenting this incident and will complete additional training in conflict resolution and de-escalation techniques. The punishment was minimal and wouldn't affect Maria's career prospects. More importantly, the formal finding of justified force cleared her record and vindicated her actions during the confrontation. In the aftermath of the hearing, Maria found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Military publications wrote articles about the case, highlighting both the self-defense aspects and the broader issues of crime on military bases. She received hundreds of messages from fellow soldiers, particularly women, thanking her for standing up to criminals and proving that female soldiers could defend themselves effectively. The 3 convicted criminals faced serious consequences for their actions. Morrison and Rodriguez were sentenced to 3 years in military prison and dishonorable discharge. Walsh, who had cooperated with the investigation and shown genuine remorse, received 2 years confinement and a bad conduct discharge. The broader criminal conspiracy was completely dismantled, with 7 additional soldiers receiving various punishments ranging from reduction in rank to court-martial and imprisonment. Base security procedures were overhauled to prevent similar criminal networks from operating in the future. Maria's reputation on base was permanently changed by the incident. Instead of being known simply as a competent logistics NCO, she became known as someone who had single-handedly disrupted a criminal organization and stood up for herself when faced with overwhelming odds. Younger soldiers, particularly women, began seeking her out for mentorship and advice. The incident also led to changes in military training and policy. Base commanders across the Army began implementing new programs to identify and prevent criminal conspiracies among soldiers. Self-defense training for all soldiers was enhanced, and new protocols were established for reporting and investigating suspicious behavior. 6 months after the hearing, Maria was promoted to Sergeant First Class ahead of her peers, a recognition of both her exemplary service record and her actions during the attempted robbery. The promotion ceremony included a special recognition from the base commander, acknowledging her role in exposing criminal activity and protecting base security. During the promotion ceremony, Maria wore her father's Purple Heart medal pinned to her dress uniform, a visible symbol of the courage that had carried her through the most challenging period of her military career. As she stood at attention while the orders were read, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The attempted robbery had tested everything she believed about courage, honor, and standing up for what was right. She had faced down not just 3 criminals in a parking lot, but also a military justice system that demanded accountability for her actions. Through it all, she had remained true to the values instilled in her by her family and her military training. Years later, when younger soldiers asked Maria about the incident, she would tell them that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what was right despite the fear. She had been afraid that morning in the parking lot, afraid during the investigation, and afraid during the hearing. But fear hadn't stopped her from defending herself, and it hadn't stopped her from telling the truth when her career was on the line. The wooden box containing her father's Purple Heart medal remained in her possession, carried in her laptop bag every day as a reminder of the courage and honor expected of soldiers in her family. The medal had survived Vietnam with her father, 2 combat deployments with her, and an attempted robbery that could have ended her career. Most importantly, it had reminded her at a critical moment that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds or the consequences. That lesson, learned in a parking lot at Fort Carson on a cold October morning, would guide Maria through the rest of her military career and beyond. The 3 criminals who had tried to steal from her that morning had thought they were targeting an easy victim. Instead, they had encountered a soldier who embodied the finest traditions of military courage and determination. Their mistake had cost them their careers and their freedom, while teaching everyone who heard the story that bullies and criminals always underestimate their victims at their own peril. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been ready to fight that day, and she had won more than just a physical confrontation. She had won a victory for every soldier who had ever been targeted by criminals, every woman who had been underestimated because of her gender, and every person who had ever stood up to bullies despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The medal that had started as a symbol of her father's courage in Vietnam had become a symbol of her own courage in a very different kind of battle. One fought not against foreign enemies, but against the criminals who preyed on their fellow soldiers. It was a battle she had won decisively, and the victory would inspire others to stand up for themselves when faced with similar challenges. In the end, they had tried stealing from her at the base, and seconds later, she had indeed been ready to fight. But the real fight hadn't been in that parking lot. It had been the months-long battle to prove that she had acted honorably and courageously when faced with an impossible situation. And that fight, like the physical confrontation that started it all, was one that Maria Santos had won completely.